The subject of today's discussion, unfortunately, much as the subject of our discussion last time, is a sad episode that we read in the Bible, that we read in the Torah. Last time we discussed the sin of the spies and its dire consequences for them and for history. Today we focus upon a very different sort of wrongdoing, the sin of Moses and Aaron. There's an obvious common denominator in that both the sin of the spies resulted in them and Israel not entering the promised land. The sin of Moses and Aaron resulted in them not entering the promised land as well. As we will see, God willing, in another few minutes, the connection between these two events evidently is much deeper still. But for now, let's begin by reviewing what the Bible has to tell us about this event, and tantalizingly, what it doesn't. We begin in Numbers chapter 20, verse 1. And the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Sin in the first month, and the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. And there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people strove with Moses and said, saying, "Would that we had perished when our brethren perished before God. And why have you brought the assembly of God into this wilderness to die there, we and our cattle? And wherefore have you made us to come up out of Egypt to bring us in unto this evil place? It is no place of seed, or of figs, or of vines, or of pomegranates, neither is there any water to drink." Very heady words of complaint, compounded, if you think about it, by the fact that the objects of this diatribe, Moses and Aaron, are presently in mourning, having just lost their sister. Well, in verse 6, Moses and Aaron came from the presence of the assembly unto the door of the tent of meeting and fell upon their faces, and the glory of God appeared to them. And here's where we get the instructions that God gave Moses. God spoke unto Moses, saying, "Take the rod, and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes, that it give forth its water. And you shall bring forth to them water out of the rock. So you shall give the congregation and their cattle drink." This was the command. Note that the first component of the command conspicuously is, take the rod. And in the next verse, indeed we read, and Moses took the rod from before God as he commanded him. This was clearly part of the instruction set. But of course, the instructions included taking the rod, not using the rod, not smiting the rock with the rod. At least that certainly is what we see in the words of God to Moses, which of course inevitably raises the question, what was the purpose of the rod altogether? Well, we read in the following verse, in verse 10, "And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them," the he is, of course, in the singular, and presumably refers to Moses, "Hear now, you rebels, are we to bring you forth water out of this rock?" Inevitably, in our considering what went wrong, This is problem number one. Moses is saying something that is nowhere indicated in God's instructions, and arguably was very much contrary to the import of God's instructions. And then we get to the critical next event, verse 11, and Moses lifted up his hand and smote the rock with his rod twice, and water came forth abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their cattle. God said to Moses and Aaron, because you believed not in me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I have given them. The promised land shut before Moses and Aaron. These are the waters of Meribah. Meribah meaning arguing, quarreling, striving, where the children of Israel strove with God, and he was sanctified in them. Of course, the tantalizing challenge, the mystery in what we just read, is the indictment of Moses and Aaron. You believed not in me to sanctify me. Boggles the mind. Where do we see a sin of lack of belief? And just what was involved here in this failure to sanctify God? Obviously, it's always important for us to bear in mind here, God doesn't need our sanctification. Presumably we do. But what was missing that failed in sanctifying God in the eyes of the people of Israel? In particular, of course, glaringly, and as much as in the following verse we read, he was sanctified in them. We can't help but focus upon Moses striking the rock. Obviously, as we already noted, this is a glaring departure from God's command to speak to the rock. But it raises at least as many problems as it solves. First of all, I'll again reiterate, God commanded Moses, this was the very first instruction, to take the rod. What was he supposed to take it for? Furthermore, if we ask, just what difference is there between smiting a rock and talking to a rock? Two observations. First of all, the rock won't know the difference. The rock certainly doesn't care. The rock is not a conscious being or a feeling being to know the difference between being talked to and being hit. And second of all, if we ask from the perspective of the magnitude of the miracle, for a rock to gush forth water, is it really a different miracle if that gushing of water from a rock is initiated by talking to the rock or by hitting the rock? Especially when we consider an earlier episode. We'll get to that earlier episode shortly. But before we do, we should certainly note that the consequences of the crime, whatever it was, and the punishment are explicit and indeed begin almost immediately. That is, 10 verses later in Numbers chapter 20, verse 23. God spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, meaning he's going to die now. For he shall not enter into the land that I have given unto the children of Israel, because You rebelled against my word at the waters of Meribah. Now, considering the evaluation, it is instructive to bear in mind that this is yet another description of the sin. That is, we saw in the initial portrayal that the sin was a failure to believe in God and a failure to sanctify God. Here, it is described as rebelling against my word at the waters of Meribah. And since the punishment is soon incoming, take Aaron and Eleazar his son and bring them up unto Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments and put them upon Eleazar his son. We should note parenthetically, this isn't part of the punishment. This, if anything, is a consolation. It is a consolation to Aaron to see his son inherit his greatness, wearing the vestments of the high priest instead of him. But the bottom line, and Aaron shall be gathered unto his people, and shall die there. That's with respect to Aaron. And with respect to Moses, in Numbers chapter 27, verse 12, and God said unto Moses, get you up into this mountain of Avarim, and behold the land that I have given unto the children of Israel. You can see it, but you can't enter it. And when you have seen it, you will be gathered unto your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. Because you rebelled against my commandments. Almost the exact same expression as we saw in the description of Aaron's death. In the wilderness of Sin, in the strife of the congregation, to sanctify me at the waters before their eyes. Another familiar motif. Again, as we saw it in the description of the sin itself. You failed to sanctify me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Sin. And once again, at the very end, at the end of the life of Moses. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, immediately after Moses' song, in verse 48, God spoke unto Moses that self-same day, saying, get you up into this mountain of Avarim, same mountain we saw in Numbers chapter 27, unto Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, that is over against Jericho, and behold the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel for a possession. Again, you'll see it. They'll possess it. You're not entering. And die in the mount whither you go up, and be gathered unto your people, as Aaron your brother died in Mount Hor, and was gathered unto his people. Because you trespassed against me. This is a different formulation. Before we saw rebellion. In the initial description of the sin, it was lack of belief. But we still return to the recurrent theme, because the continuation of the verse tells us, because you trespassed against me in the midst of the children of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Sin, because you sanctified me not in the midst of the children of Israel. This failure to sanctify God, this evidently is a central key in our understanding what went wrong and why the consequences were so dire. You shall see the land far off, but you shall not go thither into the land that I give the children of Israel. I feel compelled to interject a personal note that these words, these verses, always really jar me personally, because Moses and Aaron, with all of their extraordinary spiritual greatness, didn't merit crossing the Jordan into the western part of the land of Israel. And having, by the grace of God, merited living in that very place, in the holy city of Jerusalem, reading these words is really a jolt. What did they do that deprived them of entering the promised land on the west side of the Jordan? What happened? And how is this described as a failure to sanctify God? Now, one point that we should certainly note at the outset, and this pertains to the problem that we already considered a few minutes ago, that while in the description of the sin, we read, "You failed to sanctify me. You believed not in me to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel." The very next verse says that he was sanctified in them. And maybe understanding what that sanctification means is altogether a key in appreciating just how this sin can be described in such dire terms. Because you'll recall in Leviticus chapter 10, in verse 3, this was immediately following the deaths of Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu. Moses said to Aaron, "This is that God spoke, saying, through them who are near to me, I will be sanctified, and before all the people, I will be glorified." That is the exacting standard to which God holds those who are at the most exalted spiritual level, those who are nigh unto me. That exacting standard is a sanctification of God's name in the world, and the means through which, before all the people, I will be glorified. So, of course, in Leviticus chapter 10, those who were near unto me were Aaron's sons Nadav and Avihu, as we discussed somewhat over a year ago in Leviticus. This time around, those who are near unto God, through whom God is sanctified, through the exacting standard, through the grievous, extraordinary punishment that is meted out to them, are Moses and Aaron. So that is, on some plane, the sanctification. But of course, inevitably, we're still going to need to ask ourselves, why? What did they do that was so terrible? To further amplify the question, I intimated this passage earlier as well. We have another episode that we read in the Torah, this time in Exodus chapter 17. Granted, it happened almost 40 years earlier, but it bears such striking resemblance to what we read in Numbers chapter 20 that one can't help but consider its impact upon the story here. In Exodus chapter 17, beginning with verse 1, we read, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin by their stages according to the commandment of God and encamped in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink." Sounds familiar? Same problem as in Numbers chapter 20. "Wherefore the people strove with Moses." Also sounds familiar. Also the same in Numbers chapter 20. "And they said, Give us water that we may drink. And Moses said unto them, Why are you striving with me? Wherefore are you testing God? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, Wherefore have you brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And the solution. In verse 5, God said to Moses, pass on before the people and take with you of the elders of Israel and your rod, wherewith you smote the river. Take in your hand and go. Just like the instructions that God gave Moses in Numbers chapter 20. Take the rod. Except here there's a crucial change. Verse 6, behold, I will stand before you there upon the rock in Crave, which is, of course, another name of Sinai. And you shall smite the rock. Smite the rock. Not talk to the rock. Smite the rock. And there shall come water out of it that the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So we have almost the same event described in Exodus and the same initial instruction about taking the rod. And almost inexplicably, there is so dramatic a divergence between these two events. Is it just because in Exodus chapter 17, God commanded Moses to smite the rock, and in Numbers chapter 20, to talk to the rock? Again, I'm going to reiterate, for a rock it doesn't make a difference, does it? It is significant to note that the commonality of these two events is something noted elsewhere as well. Consider in Psalm 95, verse 8, harden not your heart as at Merivah, as in the day of Massah in the wilderness. Because after all, Merivah is, as we already saw, the name given to the place in Numbers chapter 20. And in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7, and the name of the place was called Massah and Merivah. Massah refers to the location of what we just read in Exodus chapter 17. And it's again because of the striving of the children of Israel and their testing God. So don't do it anymore. Harden not your heart as at Merivah, as in the day of Massah in the wilderness. There is an additional motif that is expressed in Psalms that is, at first brush, utterly perplexing, but I think while it raises a major question, may also provide us with a crucial key in understanding the story. In Psalm 106, verse 32, we read, they angered him also at the waters of Merivah. That, of course, referring again to what took place in Numbers chapter 20, and it went ill with Moses. Clearly, that's exactly what happened. After Israel angered God at the waters of Meribah, it went ill with Moses because Moses and Aaron were denied entry into the land. But here we read an extraordinarily perplexing postscript. And it went ill with Moses because of them, because of Israel, because of them. Now, we could, of course, conclude that because of them just means that if they wouldn't have started the argument with Moses in the first place, then he wouldn't have had to smite the rock, and then the decree preventing his entry into the Holy Land would have never been issued. But that seems like a rather circuitous route, because after all, it was Moses' action that resulted in the punishment. He committed the crime, and he was punished for it. That's not because of them. That's because of him. Isn't it? But upon further reflection, we should note that this tantalizing assertion that the punishment of Moses was because of them is one that doesn't originate in Psalms. It is, in fact, explicitly articulated in Deuteronomy. We discussed last time, in the context of the sin of the spies, the recapitulation of that sin in Deuteronomy chapter 1. Well, let's continue precisely where we left off. That is, after the description of the sin of the spies comes God's decree. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 34. And God heard the voice of your words and was wroth and swore, saying, surely there shall not one of these men, even this evil generation, see the good land that I swore to give unto your fathers. Save Caleb, son of Yephunneh, he shall see it, and to him will I give the land that he has trodden upon, and to his children, because he has wholly followed God. This, of course, we already know. This is what we already read in Numbers chapter 14. But then, in the following verse, verse 37, we read something entirely new and altogether strange. Also, God was angry with me for your sakes, saying, you also shall not go in there. What does this mean? It's important for us to bear in mind. This verse is precisely, definitely, in the context of a different story. It's in the context of the story of the spies. This verse has nothing to do with Moses' sin of smiting the rock. So why is Moses saying that in the context of the sin of the spies, God was angry with me for your sakes, saying, you also shall not go into the land? But wasn't the divine decree of Moses not going into the land something that only happened almost 40 years later because of the waters of Meribah? What's going on here? What does the sin of the spies have to do with God's decree that Moses is not to enter the land? And how altogether is that decree for your sakes? There seems to be a mysterious connection here between the sin of Moses at Meribah and the sin of the spies. It's not just the technicality that in both instances there was a punishment of denying entry into the land. Something far more fundamental is going on here, beneath the surface. It's not just in Deuteronomy chapter 1. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, likewise. Now God was angered with me for your sakes, and swore that I should not go over the Jordan, and I should not come into that good land that God, your Lord, is giving you for inheritance. But I must die in this land. I must not go over the Jordan. You are to go over and possess that good land. Here again, God's oath that Moses is not to cross the Jordan is explicitly described as for your sakes. How is it for Israel's sakes that Moses is punished ostensibly for something that he did? We may not know why it was assessed as so serious a crime, but it was his crime. He did it. It was his free will. What's going on? The reference to God having sworn, undoubtedly is further amplified by what is stated a chapter earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 3, where we read in such plaintive words, Moses is pleading with God. I besought God at that time, saying, O Lord God, you have begun to show your servant your greatness and your strong hand. For what God is there in heaven or on earth that can do according to your works and according to your mighty acts? Let me go over, I pray you, and see the good land that is beyond the Jordan, the goodly hill country and Lebanon. But God was wroth with me for your sakes. Once again, for your sakes. And hearken not unto me, and God said unto me, let it suffice you. Speak no more unto me of this matter. That's it. Get you up into the top of Pisgah, lift up your eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and behold with your eyes, for you shall not go over this Jordan. And this is all, in some perplexing manner, construed to be for your sakes. What's going on? This is a mystery, and we need to try to solve it. Not, of course, merely for the sake of Moses, but to reiterate once again a point you've heard from me over and over again. We need to solve this mystery for ourselves. Torah means teaching, and whatever the Torah describes is there to teach us. It's not a history book. Even when it's teaching us history, it's not teaching us history for the sake of history. It's teaching us history for the sake of teaching us how to live what we need to do in our lives. So, let's consider, first in particular, a crucial element of Moses' biography, who he is. Because I think it is critical for us to appreciate who Moses is in order to understand what's taking place here. And maybe the best way to describe pithily Moses' greatness is with the words we read in Exodus chapter 19, verse 3, and Moses went up to God. What a powerful, albeit short phrase. It's only 4 words in Hebrew. But it says everything. Moses isn't really part of this world. He goes beyond this world. And this is an idea that we find repeatedly articulated with respect to Moses. In Exodus chapter 24, verse 12, God said to Moses, come up to me into the mount and be there. And indeed, what we read in the following verses, Moses went up into the mount of God. Now, of course, on the most basic plane, we understand this as simply referring to climbing the mountain. But it's more than that, obviously. Because the mountain, while it is, of course, a geographical location, is not only a geographical location. Ascending doesn't just mean ascending in physical altitude. It means transcending. It means going beyond this world. In verse 15, Moses went up into the mount, and the cloud covered the mount. This is a cloud, as it were, of God's presence. Moreover, in verse 17, and the appearance of the glory of God was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain. Moses enters this fire and is not burned. The limitations of physicality don't really apply to him all that much. He's still a human being. But he's someplace beyond the mere physical world. And indeed, in verse 18, Moses entered into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mount, and Moses was in the mount 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days and 40 nights, as we read in Deuteronomy chapter 9. We'll shortly note that we also read this in Exodus chapter 34. During the course of those 40 days and 40 nights when Moses was upon the mountain, I did neither eat bread nor drink water. 40 days without any physical sustenance. Because Moses is operating at a level in which his sustenance is spiritual. He doesn't need to eat and drink. And Moses is there in this mountain of fire. God gives Moses the tablets upon which are written the words that were spoken out of the midst of the fire. And indeed, in verse 15, I turned and came down from the mount, and the mount burned with fire. And Moses is not burned. He's beyond physical. And in verse 18, as a consequence of the sin of the golden calf, Moses is back upon the mountain immediately afterward, another 40 days and 40 nights. And again, neither eating bread nor drinking water. Beyond the limitations of this world. Beyond the limitations altogether of physical existence. This is perhaps even more dramatically expressed in Exodus chapter 34, besides, as I already noted, in verse 28, reading about the 40 days and 40 nights in which he did neither eat bread nor drink water. When Moses comes down from the mountain, we read in verse 29, he knew not that the skin of his face had become radiant, sent forth beams of light while he had spoken with him. And when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face had become radiant, sent forth beams. Physical skin, if anything, shields, covers, it is opaque. Moses' skin becomes beams of light. What a dramatic expression of going beyond the limitations of physical existence. Consider also, skin is physically the limit of our persons. Everything beyond our skin is no longer part of us. So skin represents the outer limit. But if your skin becomes beams of light, you don't have that limit anymore. You're beyond limits. That's Moses. There's an additional dimension that is perhaps even more critical in our appreciating what Moses' level is. And this is perhaps best expressed, even though it's intimated in the passages we just saw, in Deuteronomy chapter 5. Moses reminds the people, God spoke with you face to face in the mountain out of the midst of the fire. I stood between God and you at that time. You were afraid because of the fire. And I was someplace in the middle. I wasn't at your level anymore. I was between you and God. And in the continuation of chapter 5 in Deuteronomy, once again, the emphasis on the fire. In verse 19, the mountain burned with fire. And in verse 20, you said, that is, all the heads of your tribes and your elders said, behold, God our Lord has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice out of the midst of the fire. We have seen this day that God speaks with man and he lives. Now, therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. We can't take it anymore. It's beyond us. The old saying, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. We're getting out. We can't handle this. It's beyond us. If we hear the voice of God, our Lord, anymore, then we shall die. For is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God speaking out of the midst of the fire as we have and lived? So we can't handle it, but you, Moses, you can. You go near and hear all that God our Lord may say, and you shall speak unto us all that God our Lord may speak unto you, and we will hear it and do it. And God graciously accepts their request. I have heard the voice of the words of this people. They have spoken unto you. They have well said all that they have spoken. And by consequence, God says to Moses, go say to them, return to your tents. You've done your share. Return to your tents, of course, doesn't just mean a geographical license to go back to your tents. Rather, on a conceptual plane, on a spiritual level, you return to your this worldly level. You return to doing the same sort of things you've always done until now. Everything you do in your tents. Everyone returns to his and her tents. Except. Verse 27, but as for you, you stand here by me, and I will speak unto you all the commandment and the statutes and the ordinances that you shall teach them, that they may do them in the land that I give them to possess it. Moses doesn't go back to his tent. Moses remains with God. Moses remains then at this extraordinary level of spirituality that really leaves this world, in some sense, behind. Yes, indeed, he is still a human being, and he still dies like a human being. But still and all, Moses attains the maximum level of transcendence of this physical world of which a human being could possibly be capable. That is Moses' greatness. Ironically, in considering Numbers chapter 20, I suspect it is also Moses' weakness. Let's consider again what the significance is of the rock and of the rod. The rock is, what can we say? A rock. Pure matter, completely physical, nothing more than physical. It represents then the physical universe, physicality generally. Now, let's first, before we return to Numbers chapter 20, return to Exodus chapter 17. Returning to Exodus chapter 17, consider in particular what the purpose was of the miraculous striking of the rock to bring forth its water. Of course, you could say the purpose was just to show the nation of Israel a miracle. And on some plane, that's undoubtedly true. But inevitably, miracles have a well-defined agenda of teaching something. What did the nation of Israel in Exodus chapter 17 need to learn? Well, what did they fail to appreciate? In verse 7, let's repeat it again. The name of the place was called Massah and Meribah because of the striving of the people of Israel, because they tested God, saying, "Is God among us or not?" They don't know that God is among them. And in some point, inevitably, the answer here has to be no, they don't. That is, they saw God manifest in the miracles of the Exodus and all that, but there's something that at this stage is still critically lacking for them in attaining the conviction that God is sovereign, that God is sovereign over everything. God isn't just sovereign over the spiritual world, God is sovereign over the physical world. They still think that while God has, I suppose, his role, his niche, there still is a recalcitrant physical world out there. And that's why we need to worry about getting something to drink, and we need to worry about getting something to eat, and we need to worry about our physical needs, because, spirituality is all well and good, but it doesn't put food on the table, does it? And the lesson that Israel needs to learn here is, as God instructs Moses, "You shall smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink." They think the physical world is intractable. They think physicality is a dead end. You'll show them the physical world is sundered. It is smashed before the spiritual. It's not that might makes right, it's that right makes might. And the rod carried by Moses as God's messenger will smash the rock, smash physicality. And all of a sudden, the limitations that you thought pertained to the physical world, that we need something to drink and we don't have any water here, won't apply anymore. Now you'll get all the water you need. The physical world, again, as symbolically represented by the rock, retreats, indeed, collapses before the might of spirituality. That's the lesson in Exodus chapter 17. And that undoubtedly was the lesson that Israel needed to learn in Exodus chapter 17. Now let's go back to Numbers chapter 20. Of course, I should say going forward with respect to Exodus chapter 17. Forward by almost 40 years. The nation has, in the interim, as we discussed at length last time when we talked about the sin of the spies, become accustomed to seeing God's miracles performed in nature. Every day they get the manna raining down from heaven. All the time they see God's guidance. So they certainly couldn't possibly deny the existence of spirituality at this point. But, as we've already seen, and indeed, as we see repeatedly in the sojourns of the nation of Israel, and what they do and what they don't do, they have a problem. Their problem, most essentially, is a problem of integration. When they're focused on spirituality, they're great. They express their absolute fidelity to God. They say to Moses, "You get all the laws, we'll carry them out, we'll obey everything." When they're functioning on a spiritual plane, they're completely spiritual. Problem is, the moment they plunge back into the physical world, spirituality is completely lost on them. And so indeed, when they don't have water, again, Numbers chapter 20, verse 2, there was no water for the congregation. Immediately, verse 3, they're striving with Moses. They're getting into a fight with him. We wish we were dead. Why we brought the assembly of God into this wilderness to die there, we and our cattle? Why do you take us out of Egypt altogether? What are you talking about? You really don't know? Just a few moments ago, you were functioning at a sublime spiritual plane. That's exactly the problem. When they're spiritual clear through to the end. And when they start focusing on the physical, they stoop to abject physicality, and anything spiritual completely falls by the wayside. They lost the message of integration, of integrating spirituality with physicality, of being able to express the spiritual through the physical. And of course, as we discussed last time, that's the reason they didn't want to go into the land of Israel. Because in the land of Israel, everything happens through nature, through the physical world. Spirituality happens through nature. You see God's blessings through nature, not by a negation of nature. The bread doesn't fall from heaven. It grows, wheat, from the ground. Through nature. You see God's blessings. Through nature. Through the physical world. You see the Spirit. And you stop drawing some artificial line of demarcation between them. That was what the nation of Israel needed to learn. And that was the lesson that God intended Moses and Aaron to teach them with the rock. Specifically, take the rod. And everyone's going to expect, oh, the rod. Just like Exodus chapter 17. You smite the rock and pulverize the physical world, and then we get all of our needs answered. You take the rod, but don't use it. You take the rod and you speak to the rock. And everyone, of course, will notice you have that rod in your hand and you're doing something different. Now, of course, we already noted. For the rock, what difference does that make? Doesn't it make any difference so far as the rock is concerned, whether you speak to it or you smite it? And altogether, is it any less of a miracle when a rock gushes forth water after being smitten than after being spoken to? It has nothing to do with the magnitude of the miracle here. It has to do with the lesson. The lesson that is described here, sanctifying God in the eyes of the people. Because they critically need to learn this lesson. That it's not by negating the physical world. It's not by going off to some mountaintop, separated from the physical world, that you find God. It isn't a spirituality that is divorced from the physical. It is rather the spirituality that you get by integrating it with the physical, by elevating the physical, not destroying it, not pulverizing it, elevating it. Like, talk to it. Again, the rock doesn't care. And again, they're both miracles. But when you smite the rock, the message you're communicating is, this is something I don't respect. When you talk to it, you're showing you respect it. This is one of the most elementary differences that we could all readily appreciate. If you hit someone, then that means you don't respect that person. If you talk to him, you are. And that was the lesson that Moses was summoned to teach Israel. Not by hitting the rock, by talking to the rock. By communicating then that message. We're not going to pulverize the physical, we're going to elevate the physical. And here is precisely where Moses failed. Because, as we just saw in those various passages from Exodus and Deuteronomy, Moses really doesn't respect the physical. Of course, not at all for the reasons that Israel has problems in integrating the physical with the spiritual. It's because Moses is at such an exalted spiritual plane, so beyond the physical world is like dust beneath his feet. It's inconsequential. So how can Moses possibly countenance showing respect for the physical world by speaking to a rock? It's just a rock. Smite it. If it's standing in the way between you and spirituality, just get rid of it. Yeah, but that's not the message that God wants Israel to hear. Because for Israel, functioning at their level, what that will just communicate is more of the same. When you're spiritual, you're divorced from the physical, and when you're physical, you're just as divorced from the spiritual. And you haven't learned anything about integrating the two. And that integration is precisely what's critical for them to hear. Moses failed to teach that lesson. But now, let's consider, again, that recurrent theme that we saw expressed in Psalm 106, and likewise in Deuteronomy chapter 1, chapter 3, chapter 4, that Moses' punishment was for the sake of Israel, because of them. What does that mean? Perhaps simply this. Moses' limitation, ironically, the limitation that results from not being limited by physicality, his limitation, because he is so transcendent, so beyond the physical world, so close to God, wouldn't be a problem if the nation of Israel had already learned the lesson of integrating the physical with the spiritual. If they knew that lesson, then Moses, representing that message of spirituality, could function as a beacon for them. Far beyond them, but nonetheless, as a leader, he could provide the guidance for them all to rise higher in spirituality, in their integrating the physicality of the promised land with the spirit. If they would have learned that lesson themselves, then Moses, being so beyond the physical, would have had a problem, but a small problem. Maybe even we could say an inconsequential problem. Then, even if he would smite a rock, the nation wouldn't have missed the point. But that was precisely the nation's problem. They hadn't learned to integrate the physical with the spiritual. And what Moses has demonstrated in smiting the rock in Numbers chapter 20 is he's not going to be the one who'll be able to teach them. Because in order to teach them that message of integration, you need to appreciate the importance of the physical world. Moses is so beyond the physical world, he doesn't appreciate its significance. And since he doesn't appreciate its significance, he can't be the teacher to teach them that message of integration. And therefore, it is for the sake of Israel that God has to say to Moses, your career is over. We need someone else. We need a Joshua who is at the same time a man of the Spirit and a brilliant military commander, a strategist, a fighter, completely personifying that integration of the physical and the spiritual he's going to be the one to lead Israel into the land. You can't. This was the failure to sanctify God's name for Israel. That message of sanctification that isn't sanctifying God in contrast with, in opposition to this world, but sanctifying God in this world, because that's what Israel needs to learn. And of course, by consequence, this was a trespass. This was a rebellion. It was even, ironically, what God describes as a lack of belief. Because once you so utterly focus on the spirit that you lose sight of the physical, then you're no longer really proclaiming God's dominion over the physical as well. Moses personally may not need to, but Israel does. And they need to learn that message. And Moses, ironically, cannot be the one to teach them. Where does that leave us? Again, of course, remembering Torah's teaching. What does it teach us? Permit me to submit that this is a challenge that on some plane confronts each and every one of us. It is so much easier to focus on matters of the spirit when we can completely divorce ourselves from this world and completely ignore everything that's taking place in this world. But that's not what God summons of us. The message of the land of Israel, which on some plane we all need to integrate, is spirituality in this world, if it's true spirituality, is integrated with this physical world. If it's not, it's some kind of fraud, something counterfeit, as we discussed last time with respect to the sin of the spies. The mandate, the challenge for each and every one of us is kind of symbolically learning how to talk to rocks instead of smiting them. Learning how to elevate the physical world rather than simply negating it. Learning how to see the physical world as the stage upon which and through which we come to God. May we indeed learn that lesson. Learn that lesson through Moses too. Through the challenge that for Moses remained elusive. And thus make ourselves and the world worthy of God's blessings. God bless you.